to the Inner Core. My name is Paul Rauschenbusch. I'm the Associate Dean of Religious Life in the Chapel at Princeton University. The Inner Core is a place where we talk about morality, ethics, religion, spirituality in everyday life. I am so pleased to welcome today to the Inner Core Professor Peter Singer. So welcome, Professor Singer. We're so glad you're here. Professor Singer is the Ira W. DeCamp Professor of Bioethics here at Princeton University, and he's also the Laureate Professor at the Center for Applied Philosophy at the University of Melbourne. He splits his time between these two great institutions. Peter Singer was named one of Time magazine's 100 most influential people in the world. He was also named one of Australia's top 10 public intellectuals. He is the author and editor of over 30 books, including one seminal book, well, many seminal books, but one in particular that I'll mention, Animal Liberation. So welcome, Peter, to this
Thank you,
program.
Paul. It's good to be with you.
So glad that you're here. So philosophy.
Yes.
Philosophy today, it has a kind of a musty, archaic feel to it. He's a philosopher. Now, is this something you always grew up saying, I want to be a philosopher when I grow up?
No, definitely not. No, I got into philosophy more or less by accident, only when I was already at university, and it was something different and interesting. And I had never really thought of doing it as a career, but I enjoyed it. When I finished it, I was offered a scholarship to do some graduate work because I'd done well at it, and it just all went on from there.
But there's one thing to think, you kind of think of the philosophers walking, I don't know if you've seen the Monty Python skit.
Oh, yes, I'm a great
the
philosophers
Monty Python fan. Going, that's one of my favorite skits. It's one thing to be thinking and for a living. It's another one to get into applied philosophy. How did that change happen, or was that always there? Were you always looking at, well, how does this thought affect the way we actually live our lives?
Well, I would certainly never have made a career out of philosophy if I had focused on issues that didn't have any impact on our lives. So, philosophers can talk about how do we know that we've got a table here between us, right? Maybe it's an illusion of some sort. Maybe we're being deceived by an artful demon. Maybe it's all a dream anyway. So those are interesting questions, but you're never really going to make a difference. Everybody's going to, put the cup down and assume it's going to stay there and not fall to the floor. So that was more like, say, solving chess puzzles.
Right.
And I couldn't have seen a career in that. But once I could see that ethics and political philosophy really could make a difference to the way we live our lives, then it seemed something worth doing.
And you, one of your most well-known books is called Animal Liberation. How did you arrive at the topic of animal rights, and how did you come to the conclusions that you reached?
Again, there was a certain amount of serendipity in it. I just happened, while I was a graduate student at Oxford University, to meet somebody who was a vegetarian and start talking to him about the way we treat animals, which I really didn't know much about it at the time. It was in the early 70s, so factory farming was not as well known, was not as dominant even as it is today, but it certainly existed. And I became appalled at learning what we do to animals, and then I started to say, well, I'm studying ethics. What are the ethics of how we treat animals? And I found that very few philosophers had even touched that topic. It was just something that they just assumed that somehow, yes, of course, all humans have dignity and moral status and rights, but animals, no, they don't. We know that. But then if you say, well, why don't they? Why are they so different from humans that they don't? Then you either got nothing at all, or you got very lame responses. They would say, well, we're rational and autonomous, and they're not. But of course, we're not all rational and autonomous. Babies are not rational and autonomous. Humans with severe intellectual disabilities are not rational and autonomous. So does that mean that they've got the same moral status as animals? No, most people would say they don't. So there was just obviously a puzzle that I had to go into, and the more I went into it, the more I thought, there's actually something seriously wrong here with the way we think about animals and the way we treat animals. And I wrote Animal Liberation to try and get people to think about that, and not only think about it, but actually act differently.
Well, I guess that's the connection there, is we can think about something and then we can act on it. How do you influence the way people connect the way they think about something and the way they act about something? Is that an automatic thing?
No, it's definitely not automatic, and that's a perennial issue in philosophy, I think, that it goes right back to Socrates. How is it that people can see what's good or right and yet not do it? So I think that we are complex beings. We have a capacity to think morally. We have a capacity to act morally and to be altruistic or benevolent. But we're also strongly self-interested beings. So very often our self-interest will distort our desire to do what's right. And I think there's that constant tussle going on in us. Circumstances can push us more in one way or another. Certain encouragement pushes us more towards acting ethically. So there are a lot of psychological factors that philosophers maybe have neglected, but I try to talk about a little bit more in some of my recent work.
Mm-hmm. Well, as long as you mention your recent work, I want to get into to make sure that we have a chance to talk about this important book. This is The Life You Can Save, which essentially gives lie to the idea that there's nothing I can do.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I mean, we really. You look at world poverty and you say, oh gosh, that's sad, but really it's out of my hands. I wish I could do something, but I can't. Maybe you can introduce us to the book by using your opening argument, which I think is so compelling.
Right, okay. So what I do to open the book is to ask the reader to imagine that they're walking past a shallow pond, maybe somewhere in a park or on a university campus, and as they walk past it, they see that a small child has fallen into the pond and is in danger of drowning, because the pond is deep enough for an adult to wade into, but too deep for a child to stand. And you look around, you say, where's the babysitter or the parents, but there's nobody else there, it's just you or the child. So you're about to rush in to save the child, and then you realize that you've put on your most expensive pair of shoes this morning. And if you stop to take them off, it might be too late. The child might drown. So the choice is, are you going to ruin a really expensive pair of shoes, or are you going to leave the child to drown? Now, I try that out on my students, and invariably they say, well, of course you've got to save the child. You can't compare a pair of shoes with a child's life. And I'm happy that they say that, naturally. I think any decent person would say that. But then I ask them to think, and in the book I ask the reader to think, well, have you given the cost of an expensive pair of shoes to save the life of one of the around 9 million children who are dying from poverty-related causes each year around the world? Because there are children that you can save just as easily as you could save that child in the pond in front of you. There are children who, by a relatively modest donation to an effective aid agency, you could save their lives. And so from there I go to saying, well, what can we do in terms of global poverty? How can we make a difference? How much should we be giving? I look at some of the objections about whether aid is really effective. And I conclude that we do have an obligation to give significantly to help the world's poor. And I suggest at the end a scale that people might use in order to decide how much is enough.
I love this book so much. I think it's so important. The Life You Can Save. One of the reasons I like it is it really does confront you with this very clear picture. This is not something that's about someone else. So you have to look inside yourself and say, well, what do I really feel about that? What am I willing to give up in order to help save a life? Yeah. We have a lot of talk about life in this world. People talking about the fabric of life, and the question is how does poverty fit into that question of life issues, with the pro-life, with the death penalty, and then poverty is a crucial part of that question. And so this book also also, for me, I don't know if you're aware of the Flannery O'Connor story that this is evocative of. There's a Flannery O'Connor who's a very caustic writer. She's amazing writer. She says, the life you save may be your own. And for me, I think that one of the things about this title is that we can't be claiming to be living a true life unless we wrestle with these questions of poverty and how we are connected with this person who we may never meet, but who our choices about where we spend our money has direct implications. It's a startling argument, and you lay out some very clear guidelines on how much each person should be giving of their income. And I have to say, when I read those guidelines, I thought, that's incredibly modest.
It is quite modest, yes.
This is not like, okay, give half of your. I mean, this is something that we can really do.
Absolutely, I think so. I wanted to set a realistic standard, but a standard that if everyone or most affluent people were to give, would provide vastly more resources than we have now to deal with world poverty, so that we could really make a significant inroad into reducing the number of people who are living in extreme poverty, and therefore, of course, reducing the number of people who die because of poverty. And so I decided to have a progressive scale that increases according to what you earn, like the tax scale, and it starts off at just 1%, and for 90% of US taxpayers, it's somewhere between 1% and 5% that I'm suggesting you give.
Up to $105,000.
That's right. That's the point at which you get into the top 10% of US taxpayers.
Yeah.
And only after that does the scale increase. But despite the fact that it's modest, if everyone in the US were to give according to that scale, it would yield $500 billion. Now, just by comparison, official US government aid for developing countries is currently $16 billion, and instead of that, we could have $500 billion.
Massively transforming the world.
It does. It completely could transform it, and of course you would want affluent people in other countries to do the same. We could really, I think, make large-scale extreme poverty a thing of the past, and that's what people don't realize.
It's incredibly exciting. Jeffrey Sachs, you also reference his work, The Economist, who it's unparalleled in human history that we actually, if we set our will to it, we could end severe poverty in this world, and that's a challenge that we need to always be putting in front of us, because it also means that every day we don't do something, we're not meeting a challenge that is meetable. This is no longer some sort of fantasy utopia. We could reduce suffering today if we were to actually not even give up that much. It's about the pair of shoes or the several pairs of shoes over the course of a year. It's about the $4 cup of coffee that we have 3 times a day because we need to keep this fuel going. And I'm, by the way, if you think I'm judging you, I'm not. I am determined to try to do better. This last year, I was looking at my own tax returns. How much did I give to? I think I'm a little short, but I was doing okay. But I did some research when I saw this book last year. I saw that Vice President Biden gave under $2,000, and he and his wife had made $250,000.
Right.
And so
less than 1%. For somebody.
Much less than 1%. I mean, this is. I thought that is really reprehensible. I mean, and this is someone who's supposed to be a moral leader of our country. And so I was, the uncharitable perspective on Joe Biden, because I really felt that this is something that he should be living up to, that we should all be trying to, and also. In a very sort of pragmatic sense, to use it in the negative way, it's tax deductible. So it actually, this is a winning solution.
Sure. Yeah. Absolutely. And I think anyone who is concerned about human life and wants to save human life, this is a very easy way to do it. You know, this is a way where you can know that you will have an effect. You don't have to petition the government to do something. You don't have to try and get a change of law. You don't have to get the Supreme Court to change its mind.
Yeah.
All you have to do is get out your credit card and go online, and it's done.
But don't you think in some ways it's back to you being confronted with the rights of animals? In some ways someone has to be confronted with poverty. Do you think that's true, or is it something that we inherently feel a revulsion towards? I mean, I think that we are so antiseptically, many of us, I mean, here we are in Princeton, in this little township, 20 minutes away, people are suffering greatly, you know, in Trenton and those environs. And because we have this kind of antiseptic separation between suffering and non-suffering until we're the ones suffering. So I don't know if part of the solution has to be exposure.
Yeah, I'm not sure that it has to be direct exposure. I suppose, I mean, my exposure was really through the media originally. Of course, now I have visited projects where aid groups are helping the poor and seen what they're doing. But that was after I got involved. I remember my first exposure way back in the 60s was the photos of the Biafran famine, you remember, in the civil war in Nigeria. And that got me to think, gosh, you know, these people have so little, and I mean, I was a student, I didn't have a lot of money, but I still had something to spare. And I think the media can show us what's happening, and we can relate to those people. So I don't think we need the sort of real face-to-face confrontation, but certainly making people realize that this is not just a mass of statistics, but that this is, you know, this family in a village who may have to watch their child die because they can't afford very simple medical treatment that could help their child to live, or this community that doesn't have safe drinking water, and so regularly children die of diarrhea because they can't afford to treat their water, they don't have the fuel to boil their water. Or, I mean, those are the sorts of things we need to break down the statistics, the billion people in poverty, and we need to tell stories about this family in Mozambique, that group in Ethiopia, these people in Cambodia, all of those sorts of things, I think, to make it real. But once we do that, I think people can relate to it.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, again, this book is fantastic, The Life You Can Save. I think I'm probably the only Christian pastor in the world to ever have compared Peter Singer to Jesus. Would you say that's a fair...
Yes, if you're going to do that, I would say you probably will be the first.
Well, no, I've already done it. I've done it from the Princeton pulpit.
Okay, great.
Only in this, I mean, not in all
I
don't want you to get a Jesus complex.
I won't.
I don't think there's much.
That.
I don't think there's much worry. Only in the sense that for me as a pastor, I see this. What is the call to sacrifice our own sense of entitlement, our own sense of luxury, in order to save the life of someone else, to be engaged with the life of someone else. If we're not willing to do that, then I don't think we're living out the gospel. And I think what I admire so much about Professor Singer is that he has forced us to confront this reality that what I do with my life is directly related to someone else's life, and in very stark ethical terms. And I think that's very helpful for everyone who is trying to live a life of integrity and morality. Now, there are others who certainly would not compare you to Jesus, and I wanted to take a moment for perhaps you to describe some of the controversy that has been around your career. And I know at Princeton, when you came, Steve Forbes decided to no longer support the university financially. There have been protests at some of your talks. And I wonder if you can articulate some of how you understand the people who object to your positions, how you articulate their views, and some of your responses.
Yes, sure. So most of this opposition comes from people who are critical of places where I depart from the traditional ethic of the sanctity of human life. As we've been talking about, I think we have a strong obligation to save life where we can do so. But I also think there are some cases where it might actually be kinder and more humane to end a human life. And one of the cases that I've talked about, probably the most controversial, is where babies are born with severe problems that are not going to be compatible with what the parents and the doctors judge to be a reasonable quality of life. Now that unfortunately happens, quite regularly, and it is fairly normal for doctors to say, because this child has these problems, we're not going to treat the child with all the modern technology that medicine makes available. And so they make a decision essentially to allow the child to die through non-treatment. And I can understand the reasons for that, and I can support such a decision. But I don't think that it's really very relevant if you think that it's better that a baby should die. I don't think it's very relevant whether the death comes about because you withdraw life support, like a ventilator, or because you actually decide to end that child's life by giving the child a lethal injection. In both cases, the intention is to end life. In both cases, the outcome is that the child dies. And I don't see a lot of ethical significance. In fact, sometimes I think that insofar as there is an ethical difference, it favors the lethal injection, because the child who is dying because you're not treating the child might die slowly over days or weeks, depending on the child's condition, obviously. And that can be an ordeal for the child, and of course for the parents or the nurses who are looking after it. So in those circumstances, I'm an advocate of active euthanasia. I think it's kinder, just as if you had a dog who was dying from some disease, you wouldn't say, well, we'll just let nature take its course and watch the dog die over days or weeks. You would say, we'll take the dog to the vet and end the dog's life. And I think this is perhaps the one area in which we treat animals better than we treat humans. So I have advocated active euthanasia in those circumstances. I also advocate it as a right for autonomous adults to choose if they're terminally ill. And those are the things that have caused a lot of controversy, protests from people in the pro-life movement, and also some people in the militant disability movement who think that I'm too ready to conclude that a life with disability is not worth living.
And how do you respond to those claims? If someone who is living a life with disability, who feels that your thought would tend to lead towards decisions to end their life, then they may feel threatened. In some ways, it just occurred to me, like people, this identification of a gay gene, and if you could change the gene and make people not gay in the womb, should it be done? Mm-hmm. This idea of like how, it invalidates the life that is being lived in some ways, saying it's not actually a realization of a full life.
Well, I think the gay gene is maybe a different example, because you would want to ask the question, do we think that life with attraction to your own sex is any worse than life without it? And that's where that controversy is. But in the case of severe disabilities, most people are in no doubt that life is worse. I mean, you have to ask yourself, why did we ban thalidomide? You remember thalidomide is the drug which was actually really mostly a sleeping aid that when pregnant women took was shown to produce deformities. Children were born without limbs, for example. Now, we banned that drug, and I haven't heard anybody saying that that was the wrong decision, that we should allow pregnant women who want to sleep better to take a drug that will mean their children are born without limbs. So that means that we assume that it's better to have limbs and functioning limbs than not to have them. I don't think that's a controversial judgment. It doesn't mean, though, that if somebody whose mother did take thalidomide is now alive and is obviously doesn't affect their intelligence, is capable of assessing their life and saying, I want to go on living, I think my life is worthwhile, yes, I have some disabilities, but I can surmount them this way and that. Of course that person has as much of a right to life as you or I do. We want to respect that person's wish to go on living. We want to make life easier for them if we can with some kinds of assistance. So I don't think that anyone who is capable of understanding my views and therefore obviously competent to decide for themselves whether they want to go on living should feel threatened by what I'm saying, any more than they would feel threatened by the fact that as a society we decided to ban that drug because of the deformities it was causing.
You were accused of being similar to Nazism and this kind of thing, and that was obviously a very painful association for you.
Yes, it was, because I'm of Jewish background, and 3 of my 4 grandparents were murdered by the Nazis. So I think I know what the Nazis were about. I've studied their views, and I think what I'm talking about is really completely different. I have no sympathy for ideas that say we want to get rid of people because their racial background or because in some way they're a blot on the Aryan folk. I'm talking about trying to prevent suffering and for people who don't want to go on living themselves, or in the case of babies, allowing parents to make that judgment for themselves and their family.
So in closing, I know a lot of students who are philosophy majors here at Princeton, and I think it's wonderful. They're incredibly bright and smart and engaged. What advice do you have for a young philosopher?
Well, my advice for a young philosopher, or really for any young student, is to think about the kind of life you want to live and how it can advance the values that are most important to you. And I hope that those values will be ones that include trying to make your life into something that improves the world for others as well. Because I think that's actually the most satisfying life for us to lead personally, to feel that we are really making a difference somehow, that we're not just living for ourselves. And I think through philosophy we can think about those issues of values in a deep way that can help us and others to find the way in which we can make a difference to the world. But it doesn't have to be through philosophy. I think it can be through a wide range of other studies and other activities that you make a difference.
Right. I'm not sure if you're aware of my family connection with Dick Rorty. Richard Rorty. I was a cousin.
All right.
And he was a philosopher and till his death last year. But he also encouraged people maybe not to study philosophy, or not to end there, and to go study do something that would actually fulfill, I guess, the ethical mandates of philosophy.
Yes.
Interestingly, towards his death, I had a chance to meet with him and ask him about, he knew he was dying, and I asked him, what philosophy had to say about his death, his imminent death, and he said, philosophy has nothing to say about death. Only poetry has something to say about death. Well, at first I went with religion, but we had, and he was, we were, I had deep respect for his viewpoints, and he said to me, I said, are you thinking about God at all? And he said, Paul, I can't be in love with something I'm not in love with. And I thought that was a very gentle way to put it. And then I asked about philosophy, and he said, philosophy has nothing to say about death. Only poetry has something to say about death. I wonder, what are your views about what does philosophy have to say with life after death? I think you do a lot with what philosophy has to say with life, but what is it?
I mean, obviously, philosophers in the past have speculated about life after death, but I think it is something that we would need evidence for. I'm very much an empiricist on those things. I say, if somebody wants to believe something, I say, what's the evidence for it? I haven't seen any good evidence for life after death, so I'm not a believer. I think death is the end. Some people find that psychologically difficult thing to accept, but I suppose I've believed that pretty much all my life, so I'm quite comfortable with it.
Well, I hope you know some good poetry.
Oh no, I don't agree with Richard Roddy totally on that. I think philosophy can help, because I think if you feel that you've lived a good life and you've achieved what you wanted to, you know, I think it's going to be easier to accept the end of your life than if you felt somehow you never did the kinds of things that you wished you'd done.
Professor Singer, thank you so much for being on
Paul.
The Inner Core. This has been another edition of The Inner Core. We're so glad that you joined us here today, and we look forward to seeing you next time.
So that was more like, say, solving chess puzzles.
Right.
And I couldn't have seen a career in that. But once I could see that ethics and political philosophy really could make a difference to the way we live our lives, then it seemed something worth doing.
And you, one of your most well-known books is called Animal Liberation. How did you arrive at the topic of animal rights, and how did you come to the conclusions that you reached?
Again, there was a certain amount of serendipity in it. I just happened, while I was a graduate student at Oxford University, to meet somebody who was a vegetarian and start talking to him about the way we treat animals, which I really didn't know much about it at the time. It was in the early 70s, so factory farming was not as well known, was not as dominant even as it is today, but it certainly existed. And I became appalled at
the 100 most influential people in the world. He was also named one of Australia's top 10 public intellectuals. He is the author and editor of over 30 books, including one seminal book, well, many seminal books, but one in particular that I'll mention, Animal Liberation. So welcome, Peter, to this
Thank you,
program.
Paul. It's good to be with you.
So glad that you're here. So philosophy.
Yes.
Philosophy today, it has a kind of a musty, archaic feel to it. He's a philosopher. Now, is this something you always grew up saying, I want to be a philosopher when I grow up?
No, definitely not. No, I got into philosophy more or less by accident, only when I was already at university, and it was something different and interesting. And I had never really thought of doing it as a career, but I enjoyed it. When I finished it, I was offered a scholarship to do some graduate work because I'd done well at it, and it just all went on from there.
But to the Inner Core. My name is Paul Rauschenbusch. I'm the Associate Dean of Religious Life in the Chapel at Princeton University. The Inner Core is a place where we talk about morality, ethics, religion, spirituality in everyday life. I am so pleased to welcome today to the Inner Core Professor Peter Singer. So welcome, Professor Singer. We're so glad you're here. Professor Singer is the Ira W. DeCamp Professor of Bioethics here at Princeton University, and he's also the Laureate Professor at the Center for Applied Philosophy at the University of Melbourne. He splits his time between these two great institutions. Peter Singer was named one of Time magazine. But there's one thing to think, you kind of think of the philosophers walking, I don't know if you've seen the Monty Python skit.
Oh, yes, I'm a great
the philosophers
Monty Python fan.
going, that's one of my favorite skits. It's one thing to be thinking and for a living. It's another one to get into applied philosophy. How did that change happen, or was that always there? Were you always looking at, well, how does this thought affect the way we actually live our lives?
Well, I would certainly never have made a career out of philosophy if I had focused on issues that didn't have any impact on our lives. So, philosophers can talk about how do we know that we've got a table here between us, right? Maybe it's an illusion of some sort. Maybe we're being deceived by an artful demon. Maybe it's all a dream anyway. So those are interesting questions, but you're never really going to make a difference. Everybody's going to, put the cup down and assume it's going to stay there and not fall to the floor. Learning what we do to animals, and then I started to say, well, I'm studying ethics. What are the ethics of how we treat animals? And I found that very few philosophers had even touched that topic. It was just something that they just assumed that somehow, yes, of course, all humans have dignity and moral status and rights, but animals, no, they don't. We know that. But then if you say, well, why don't they? Why are they so different from humans that they don't? Then you either got nothing at all, or you got very lame responses. They would say, well, we're rational and autonomous, and they're not. But of course, we're not all rational and autonomous. Babies are not rational and autonomous. Humans with severe intellectual disabilities are not rational and autonomous. So does that mean that they've got the same moral status as animals? No, most people would say they don't. So there was just obviously a puzzle that I had to go into, and the more I went into it, the more I thought, there's actually something seriously wrong here with the way we think about animals.